The sitting is resumed. Speakers. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me and giving me this opportunity to make a contribution to this particular bill, which is an amendment of our Constitution. But first of all, I just want to congratulate you, of course, on your election at a previous meeting as President of this Honourable Senate. You have, in the last session, I thought, ruled fair, and I think it created a general harmony among all the senators. And I'm sure that you will continue in that light of fairness and even-handedness throughout this session as we go forward. And I also take this opportunity as well, Mr. President, to congratulate as well all those new senators who are joining us for this session. I look forward, of course, to hearing all of the contributions and all of the debate. I've already heard a contribution from one of the newest and I believe younger senators, and I was impressed. And I'm sure that as we move along, we will see that level of good presentations and good contributions being maintained. Mr. President, the bill before us speaks to two amendments, which in principle, I don't think that there's a lot to fault them on, because I think they are both well-intentioned. I don't think any of us would argue against the contribution that young people in general have to and must be encouraged to make as we go forward. This is a new republic. It is the young people, particularly with their energy, with their knowledge and so on, who will be required to give us the new innovative ideas, and who we will look to be the future leaders. So I don't think any of us in this honorable chamber would argue against including or the inclusion of young people in political participation. Already 18-year-olds have the right to vote. And so, we can discuss, of course, whether or not 18 is, in fact, a mature enough age to be actually representing or a constituency of electors in Parliament. And there's no right and wrong about it. There's no definitive age range. People mature at different ages, of course. And so I think that it is an open question. Perhaps more discussion on it would nudge us in a more certain direction as to where we see the young people as moving. But apart from representation in Parliament, there are lots of other ways which our young people can contribute in a positive way to the development and the improvement of life, particularly for their demographic. And so, you know, we can look to have some appointed on boards, for example, particularly boards which have influence on youth, sports council and other such boards, education, school boards, and so on. So I think to see that it shouldn't be seen as this is really so significantly different from allowing young people to make representation in all the other areas. But, Mr. President, it concerns me somewhat now, and over time we have been raising, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Senate, the body of senators have been raising, how we seem to be going about making amendments to our Constitution. It is almost becoming like, you know, when we amend some a bit of legislation for the Road Traffic Act, or you know, it seems to be coming so frequent, and without an opportunity to really take the overall Constitution and have a look at it and decide as we go forward and we move it and we make amendments to the Constitution to reflect the new era in which we are living, that we look at it more in a holistic manner, not in the kind of a peace way in which we have been doing it. And you know, Mr. President, we have gone through, perhaps about 3-4 months ago, 5, in this Senate chamber, discussion about an amendment to the Constitution to allow a changeover to Republican status and to allow a president to be appointed. There was general feedback, general reaction from the public, from the senators, that, you know, perhaps at that time we were doing it the wrong way. We were kind of putting the cart before the horse. We needed to be able to have an opportunity for the general population, the general public, to be able to ventilate their views about the Republican status, about what type of Republican status we should have, how it should be the structure of Parliament, the structure of the Senate, and all these issues. But at the time, the powers that be insisted that it had to be done by November the 30th. And we were given the clear understanding, I still remember it very well, that okay, all we are doing now is making this amendment to allow a president to be appointed and to achieve our Republican status. But after the year has turned, from January 2022, we were given a firm promise, a firm commitment, and that we would take the Constitution and we would go through it. And I heard the leader of government business, Senator Cummings, referring to that point earlier this morning in a presentation where we said, look, we will take it and we will systematically go through the Constitution chapter by chapter and do all of the analysis. And by the way, I also congratulate Senator Cummings on her new status as leader of government business in the Senate. And, you know, eventually we all fall in line, we all fell in line and said, okay, we will support these amendments at this time, but we look forward to doing this systematic review of the Constitution. So I find it is difficult to accept now that, and in fact, having announced that the Constitution Review Commission is going to start its work very soon, and in fact identifying a chairman of the Constitution Review Commission, we now find that we are here debating issues which could probably be taken and ventilated before this commission. So again, here it is, we seem to be somewhat putting the cart before the horse. And I sense, Mr. President, that we are getting this feedback from the general public more and more these days that nobody is consulting them. We've heard the unions complaining they're not consulted about various bits of legislation pertaining to changes to national insurance, etc. We've heard the private sector complaining. We've heard people complaining about the fact that we appoint that we have additional national heroes, and we've not gone through the process of this sort of consultation, which we had expected or had hoped for. And I think it is not the way to go. I don't want to see a new administration and a new organs of government moving forward in the way that we have gone, where we have these complaints from time to time about not consultation. The government has set as its standard that it will consult, that it will be open, that it will be transparent, that the things that we do will not be left to the whims and fancies of one or two individuals, but that government will listen to the general public and make sure that their concerns are heard, even if at the end of the day they obviously will have to make their own decisions as the government, but that opportunity must be extended. And I have to ask myself, when you look at these two amendments, is there any urgency in either of them, which really requires that they must be done now, and that they can't be delayed until the Constitution Review Commission starts its deliberations? Well, we have heard, and Senator Boyce earlier made it quite clear that there's provision under Section 75, I think it is, to deal with the issues of appointment of other senators at this time. So it isn't that there isn't sitting right now on our statute books provisions for dealing with that issue. And so why not give the general public the opportunity to give their 2 cents worth, to make their input in terms of whether they see that these proposed amendments are necessary, or if they are, what are the considerations should be taken into account. I heard also Senator Rogers speak, and it's a concern which I also had, which is basically because of our system as it stands right now, where you can be sitting with the government on one day, and the next day you're sitting as opposition, or you're in the opposition one day, and the next day you're sitting with the government. And we have seen, as was articulated in the past, where people have left one side and gone over to the other and formed an opposition. And so while the amendment which is being proposed seem to be simple and straightforward at first, when we look at some of those issues as to how we would deal with persons crossing the floor to become leader of the opposition, as has happened already, we realize that it introduces other issues for which we will probably have to take under consideration. Mr. President, I don't need, I think, to rehash what the other two independent senators have said so far. I totally agree with their contributions and with their concerns. And I think that I would straight out that these are really issues which the government should at least give the Constitution Review Commission an opportunity to come forward with firm recommendations, and that, as I said, I don't think that these two amendments in either case is that urgent that they need to be done now. And with those few words, Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Senator Minard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I too would like to congratulate you on being returned to the chair. And I would like to welcome
Thank you very much.
all senators to this chamber, particularly those who are sitting here for the first time. It is not an easy task. Mr. President, I wish to remind you specifically of a motto that says, non sibi sed omnibus. And in English, it means not for ourselves, but for all. And when I was a boy going to school at foundation school, sir, I realized after a while that if you listen to it, those short lines of Latin, it could influence your whole life. And there have been times in my professional career, and there still are times when I'm exceptionally tired in the wee hours of the morning when most people are asleep, and I could make convenient decisions about treating the patient that might be to their advantage, and I have to remember that motto. Senator Walcott would have gone through it many times when he was actively practicing. And it means really that you must always be mindful that you can't only consider what you want, but what is best. You'll get it wrong sometimes, but you have to do what is best. I've asked myself, Mr. President, what problem are we solving? And you like to come up with solutions to problems, not solutions to problems that don't exist. And I am reminded that I'm not a lawyer, I'm only a doctor who happens to be a surgeon. But Section 5 of the Constitution says that the problem that we are solving has an existing solution. And solution is clearly written, that the appointment of the two opposition senators in the absence of a leader of the opposition can be done by the president. So I asked, what problem are we solving? And as some of my colleagues have pointed out, there is, on analysis, the appearance that in this passing this legislation, if it passes, we might create other problems. And I want to comment on a little political history. And I think it's important I say this on my feet. I'm new to this game. but I suffer with insomnia, so I read excessively. And Mr. President, there was an occasion when an opposition party was displaced from its position when members of the ruling party crossed the floor. It happened in this chamber, Mr. President. So to say that something will not happen, lightning sometimes strikes twice, and it can strike 3 times. There's no limit to how often lightning can strike. Mr. President, I listened to young Senator Boyce and his strong presentation with regard to the youth. And I agree that youth representation is absolutely important. They are the future. I've always been an advocate for it. As a doctor, and often at school when I got put in detention because my views were not in keeping with what was desired. But Mr. President, there was a mantra that used to be said in this house: promise made, promise kept. Do not bury it. Resurrect it. You make a promise, keep it. When this country declared it was going to become a republic in its own speech, and subsequently it was said, we will go ahead because we do not need a referendum. We have a strong, overwhelming political mandate. And we moved to republic, amended the Constitution, and we elected a president. And it was said, we will have a year of intense constitutional review with a Constitutional Review Commission. And I ask, what has become of it? What is the rush? Why do we need, or why do we not allow the Constitutional Review Commission to allow the public, in the absence of referendum, to have its say on changing some of the entrenched parts of the Constitution? We should allow the Constitutional Review Commission to have its say. And we should live by the statement, promise made, Mr. President, promise kept. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Neary. Other speakers? Senator Drakes.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, and good afternoon to all members of this honorable chamber. I congratulate all new members, Sir yourself being re-elected, Senator Cummins for now leading government business, and Mr. President, you were not here when we were in this place before, when we then moved to Worthing. But I must say, Mr. President, it is good to be back home, albeit in a different room, but it is good to be back home. Mr. President, I will make a short submission this afternoon to the constitutional amendments that is before this House. More so from the perspective that I am one of the younger members in the chamber, and having come into the Senate at the age of 30, I believe I was in the category of being one of the youngest to sit in the upper chamber. Mr. President, what was very clear to me on that introduction was sometimes it's good to talk about something, but once you get into the responsibility of the action, sometimes the weight, you underestimate it. Because, Mr. President, when you are bestowed this honor of representation, there are some things that intellect can only carry you so far. There's a school of thought, Mr. President, that says science has now reached its limits and is causing certain moral challenges in our society because we focus so much on what is rather than what ought to be. And I say that in the context, Mr. President, that with time and experience come instinctive wisdom as well as intuitive wisdom. Those things cannot be given to you in a classroom or in a textbook. You have to live it. And if you're living right, then you take those lessons with you and you build your wisdom as you go forward. And that wisdom then allows you to have certain convictions when you're faced with choices. Mr. President, I am in no way here standing saying that 18-year-olds should not be eligible to sit in the Senate. That, Mr. President, will get my full support. I understand that the Senate, based on its configuration, and you're appointed, Mr. President, I believe that 18-year-olds should have the opportunity to sit in the upper house. I, however, Mr. President, have my reservations. I have my reservations, Mr. President, with an 18-year-old being able to sit as an elected member of the House of Assembly. And I say that on the backdrop of there's an ugly side to politics, Mr. President. It is not roses and candy all the time. And when you have an 18 or 19-year-old who, by whatever account, and I'm not saying that they may not have the wherewithal intellectually, but can succumb then to the ugly side of politics, there is caution for me, Mr. President. Because I know that as much as we stand here and we say, yes, it is a good thing, how many 19-year-olds are sitting on boards at this moment? That does not stop us from electing them to sit on boards. How many 19-year-olds are on boards at the moment? How many 19-year-olds are appointed to being CEOs of any of the state-owned enterprises, for instance? And I'm not saying that this is not a step in the right direction, but I'm just asking the question, if then this constitutional amendment, particularly for the House of Assembly, is supposed to, at face value, we're supposed to come and we're supposed to pass it, then within our society, why are there reservations in appointing somebody at that age in these senior positions? Mr. President, any parent who runs a house would not give their income to their teenager and tell them, you handle the business of the house. They wouldn't do it. Because there's certain things you just have to learn as you grow, Mr. President, as you evolve in age. There's a saying that one of my friends, who is also young, says to me, and sir, I will admit that I am in my early 30s, so I'm not that young anymore. Father Time is undefeated. Father Time is undefeated, and it is only now that I'm rolling into my mid-30s, Mr. President. There are a lot of things, Mr. President, that make a lot of sense. That you told me that at 25 or at 24 even, I would have dismissed it and said, I know best. I know better than you. And sometimes that's the case. But most times, there is wisdom that is being instilled on you at that early age to guide you. So, sir, as I said, I have my reservations as it relates to the age being lowered, and I will not stand here and say that the government does not have its good intentions. I also still believe that the people of Barbados should have a say in that matter. It is a significant matter, because there's also the issue of manipulation and persuasion. There are older persons who would take advantage of younger people who are not, because of their their inability to know what is happening around them, be persuaded into situations where they're unable to make the right decisions. And because they have the peer pressure around them, Mr. President, would guide them in a direction that is not best for them, but what is best for the older individual. And these are the kinds of scenarios that we have to think about. Life is not all rose-colored and fairy tales, Mr. President, especially when you're talking about politics. Sir, young people also have sometimes the ability to just say what they want to say in a moment of haste and heat. And the public scrutiny that comes with that, Mr. President. There's some people who may not be able to, even in their old age, be able to cope with the kind of criticisms, especially if you're talking about the Barbadian public. They can be ruthless, Mr. President, in their criticisms when we say and do things that they do not agree with. But that is the totality of what we're talking about today when we're talking about these amendments. And I am in no way saying, sir, that in this new republic, young people should not have a voice. I would never stand here and say that. But, Mr. President, I still have reservations. When we talk about things like campaign financing and funding, when you really get into the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts of elective politics, as I said, intellectual understanding will only get you so far. But, Mr. President, there are people who are out there that are vultures to the system. And if you're young and impressionable enough, they will take advantage of you. So the framers, I'm sure, Mr. President, in that era and in that time, had their reasoning for the age being 21. And for me, it is a case of a pause, a step back. Let the Barbadian public have their say in if we wish to reduce the eligibility of an elected member in the House of Assembly, because I am in no way going to stand here and say that I speak for all Barbadians. That is not what I'm saying. All I am saying, Mr. President, is there are two sides to this coin. And in promoting the youth, let's also protect them. Because, Mr. President, as was said on more than one occasion, and I will repeat it, we've had a snowball of events where we've been promised one thing, and yet we find ourselves in a situation where the promise is broken. I was one, Mr. President, when we moved to a republic, and I still believe that we put the cart before the horse. I believe that was said earlier. And we continue to make these decisions, Mr. President, out of sync, that then forces us to come to make decisions that seem inconsistent, and it appears that we will be causing further harm if other eventualities arise. So, Mr. President, I will just say that your word is your bond, and that is all you have in this life. Your word is your bond. Keep your word. I, like the rest of the independent senators who have spoken, wholeheartedly believe that the constitutional reform should address these matters, and it should not be left up to those members, just the members here in this chamber and in the other place. Yes, the government has been given an overwhelming majority at the polls. No one will refute that. Twice over, Mr. President. But there's still some sections of our society, and given the amount of people who stayed home at election time, who I'm sure still want to have a say in what the Constitution of Barbados looks like in this new republic. Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drakes. Other speakers? Senator Cummings. There be no more speakers.
Mr. President, thank you very much to all of the speakers who have taken the floor. At this time, it appears that we're going to have to just suspend and defer further consideration of this bill. So I beg to suspend further consideration of this measure.
The question is that further consideration of this bill be postponed. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Further consideration of this bill is therefore postponed.
Order number 7, sir.
Order number 7.
In the name of the Honourable Leader of the House, to move the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2022.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to move the second reading of the Appropriations Bill. As members are aware, on, I believe it was Wednesday night, the other place completed deliberations on the Appropriations Bill and had a complete review of the estimates of expenditure for the financial year 2022 to 2023. We also had in the other place an extensive debate at the level of the well, where you saw several heads of expenditure debated by way of the appearance of officials in the well, presenting on the estimates and how they propose to spend government revenues over the course of the upcoming financial year. You saw, for example, Mr. President, the members in the other place across the various ministries outline what the government's priorities would be for the upcoming financial year. You heard about the housing revolution that is required. You heard also about the importance of having a complete road and infrastructure transformation program. You have heard also about the importance of our social welfare and people empowerment program, Mr. President. And you heard, very importantly also, especially in light of what is happening now in Eastern Europe, also about what is critical in terms of our energy infrastructure, our renewable energy agenda, and how we are going to treat at the business level, at the level of people as well, to the questions of the cost of living increases and how those things impact ordinary Barbadians. Mr. President, you heard also from our government officials on how we are going to treat to public sector reform. You heard also from our officials how we were going to treat to fiscal management and dealing with our state-owned enterprises. It was unquestionably so a comprehensive overview of the government's program. Over the course of the coming days here in the Senate, you will hear in the initial stages a debate coming among the colleagues on the various elements in particular that were also raised in particular by the public and the issues that we would need to bring to your attention. But Mr. President, I wish to start first by framing the context for this appropriations bill. I believe we have heard colleagues speaking about all of the challenges that the world is facing. Mr. President, if we were to take a backward view, everyone knows the things that are in our rearview mirror. We know that in 2018, where we came from up until 2020, we knew all the things that happened in 2021. And then we have a forward view, Mr. President, and those are the things that we have to be able to balance in these estimates of expenditure. Mr. President, when we talk about housing and transforming our housing stock, when we talk about the number of persons who are in need of emergency housing, when we speak about the number of persons, Mr. President, who have been on an NHC list for 20 years and for 30 years and the need for a revolution, we cannot speak about those things, Mr. President, without also considering the fact that there were 20,000 people who were affected simultaneously on top of those numbers over the course of the last year by Hurricane Elsa. We cannot discount the fact, Mr. President, that even as far back as Tropical Storm Thomas, there were people who still needed to have their housing infrastructure looked at. We cannot talk, Mr. President, about the importance of ensuring that we have new engineering and new construction methodologies, and we've spoken about the Construction Gateway Project and what that's going to mean for these estimates of expenditure, Mr. President, without also acknowledging that we live in a space where climate change and climate adaptation and sustainable development are central to our conversations, Mr. President, and the loss of roofs in hurricanes, and as we approach the hurricane season, Mr. President, we cannot have those conversations about our forward view, Mr. President, without understanding how the compound impact of our backward view has put us in a position where we have to navigate how we spend the resources that we have. We cannot, Mr. President, talk about what our planning is going to be for the allocation of over $1.8 billion in expenditure over the upcoming financial year without an understanding that during the last financial year, we lost $600 million from our revenue base as a result, Mr. President, of COVID-19 and shutdowns in our economy. We cannot divorce those things from our backward view, Mr. President. All of them must be and have been taken into account as we go forward. Mr. President, we cannot equally so speak about our forward view and ensuring that our people have access to supplies, including critical food supplies, without treating to the supply chain interruptions that have taken place globally and the tripling almost of container freight pricing and shipping costs over the course of the last 8 months or so. We cannot also, Mr. President, speak about the development of our agricultural sector, ensuring that we have food security and that we're able to lower our food import bill without looking at the implications of the fact that in a war in Eastern Europe, 30% of wheat production has been taken out as a result of a war. We do not live in a space on our own. We live in a global community where both domestic and international factors are and have affected us for the last several years, Mr. President. And so where we are now in these estimates of expenditure forces the government to make critical decisions about what we have to do now in order to deal with what has gone before and where we intend to go and to take our people. Mr. President, there are about 4 pillars that I want to speak about today in my contribution on the estimates debate. Financial management. Mr. President, in 2019, when this administration brought the Public Finance Management Act to this chamber, we spoke extensively about the importance of having a new fiscal framework. We brought legislation at the time in 2018 and into 2019 that spoke about the reform of our regulatory management, our financial management, and our fiscal affairs overall, so that the issues that we were confronted with in 2018 when we first came to office, we would not face again. So, Mr. President, when we talk about things like reform of state-owned enterprises, and that's been a conversation that has come up, Mr. President, in 2019, when we passed the Public Finance Management Act, the Public Finance Management Act outlined in great detail, in particular in Schedule 2, the list of both commercial state-owned enterprises and state-owned enterprises and created an expansive framework that governed how they were to treat to government resources. Mr. President, you now have state-owned enterprises coming from 2019 that have a responsibility to submit biannual reports. Every 6 months, once a year. It details in it goes into great detail to outline what must be contained within those reports, the 6 monthly reports and the 1 year reports. It speaks, Mr. President, about what needs to be done in terms of approval of finances. It removed the opportunity for state-owned enterprises to take the actions that were taken prior to 2018, Mr. President, where they assumed debt liabilities with no reference to central government. All of those things were removed in 2019 in the Public Finance Management Act. And so those were some of the things in the backward view that put us in a position where we are now moving forward to ensure that that fiscal framework that is in place allows us to support strong fiscal management, and we are in a position to say that those things have been done. We've also been looking in terms of managing our fiscal affairs at the questions of access to credit. Now, I don't know many Barbadians, and maybe I only know people of a certain income class, Mr. President, but I don't know many Barbadians who buy their homes 100% cash. Most people have to go and take a mortgage. Most people I know, in my world at least, take a mortgage, and they have to pay back that mortgage. Now, whether you get that mortgage at 2%, at 3%, or at 6% matters, because that has a direct impact on what your repayments on a monthly basis will look like. So there are some financing companies, Mr. President, that sometimes we accuse of predatory lending. And we've heard it described here, and you may see 15% or 20% because someone needs money very quickly, and they go and they get this cash and they're not able to pay it back. So, Mr. President, we as a country found ourselves in a position equally up until 2018 where our access to credit was severely curtailed by our debt levels. And we were only able to borrow at what could best be described almost as predatory lending rates. And so we found ourselves borrowing money to be able to support our development in ways that took us out of our affordability ratios, and then we found ourselves sinking further and further into debt in the same way that we would see persons who go for very quick access to loans and are now unable to pay them back. So once we have settled the question of strong financial management, Mr. President, we then started to look at the question of the growth agenda. And certainly Senator Drake from 2018, when she joined this honorable chamber, has been speaking about the growth agenda. And we've continued to say the same thing, and we say the same things here now. Growth is multi-layered. It is multifaceted. It is both in the existing and the traditional sectors. It is both in the new and the expanded sectors, and it is in the new growth agenda as well. And we have spoken in these estimates about some of those things, and I will go into them in some detail. So, for example, Mr. President, under the Barbados Investment and Development Corporation, now rebranded as Export Barbados under the Ministry of Industry and Innovation, Science and Technology, under that ministry, we now see an expanded role for life sciences. We now see an investment in a life sciences park, and the Honourable Minister in the other place spoke in great detail about what is envisioned in that life sciences park. You've heard also under this ministry and under Export Barbados the development of free zones, where you are able to see an expanded role for economic activity. These are not necessarily fields, Mr. President, and open fields only on there in terms of agricultural production and for exports. We're talking about the sectors of the future, the growth agenda of the future. And positioning Barbados is a population that has always prided itself on being highly tertiary level educated and highly skilled. We're focusing attention, Mr. President, on those growth agendas that create opportunities for that highly skilled population. Mr. President, we're also talking about looking at manufacturing. You heard in that ministry also under the broad ministry, you heard the reports coming in out of the Export Barbados Agency about expanding manufacturing. What does expanded manufacturing look like, Mr. President? We will see more of that as we go through the estimates today. Then, under the Ministry of Investment, you will hear more about what investment portfolios have been attracted into the country. Mr. President, I happen to be the minister responsible for tourism. Tourism investment falls under the Ministry of Investment, but I will speak during the course of today on the investment and the capital projects that are meant to move growth in this country. But I did speak about agricultural growth earlier. We have to be able to feed ourselves, Mr. President. One of the things that we have seen is that as countries shut down or as countries find themselves facing challenges, they begin to stockpile. They begin to impose export restrictions. They begin to hoard, Mr. President, and the prices continue to increase. Now, Barbados has to find itself in a space, and we have seen the minister responsible for agriculture speaking at great length along with the Prime Minister on the relationships that are being forged between Barbados and other countries in the region, most recently between Barbados and Guyana, to ensure that we can expand agricultural production, not only in open field agriculture here in Barbados, but in partnerships between Barbados and Guyana where there is a land mass, but also getting into more technology-driven types of agriculture, including containerized agriculture. You will hear more about the Ministry of Agriculture and what they're doing there, Mr. President. But economic growth on its own, financial management on its own, Mr. President, cannot take our people where they need to go. And so the third pillar that you will hear us talking about today, Mr. President, is that developmental agenda, and inbuilt into that developmental agenda, social well-being for our people. How are our people cared for. Now, Mr. President, I must say that in 2008, when we were going into the 2008 election, I always remember looking at the time at the manifesto of the government at the time, not the Barbados Labour Party government, it would have been the other side. And I remember saying at the time that it was a strong social policy manifesto in principle. But I looked through the manifesto and I could not find where they were going to pay for the things that they wanted to do. In order to take care of your people, you have to be able to have a strong economic base that allows you the space, the fiscal space, to pay for the social services. Now, Barbados is a special place, Mr. President. Barbados is a special place, and we must never forget it. Barbados has such an extensive social safety net when compared to most countries in the world. We must never take it for granted. But that does not mean that there are not areas where we still have work to do. It doesn't mean that there are not people who are still left behind. It doesn't mean that the agenda for poverty eradication and greater levels of inclusion is not still necessary for us to have top of mind. All of those things are necessary. And so it is critical that as we manage what we have and we earn more, that we spend more on those who cannot for themselves do what they would want to have done. We have to look after our people, and that is the third pillar, Mr. President. That must include people empowerment. It must include connections between crime, violence, deviance, and family relationships, because in many instances, the home which births many of our children and the communities that are not shepherding or raising many of our children then translate into some of the challenges that we see on the other side of the fence, and we have to be able to pull those things together. Or alternately, when someone doesn't necessarily fit in to a space or they feel as though they don't belong and they find themselves on the wrong side of the law, when they have been rehabilitated, and rehabilitation must be a must, and we will hear about that under the Ministry of Home Affairs as well as under the Office of the Attorney General, we have to allow them the space to live and breathe again, and to allow them to be reintegrated into our societies and to be given second chances. Labor becomes a critical part of that, Mr. President, and so you have heard and you will continue to hear from this side all about the agenda for a new relationship in terms of the relationships with our trade union partners and also in terms of how we treat to employee relations with employers. Mr. President, those 3-4 things then lead us to the fifth element, which is strong positioning for our future. These estimates of expenditure, Mr. President, put us in a position where across every ministry, across every sector, touching every person, not in every way that we would want to, I have to confess, because we simply aren't able to do everything we would want to, but we want to, we need to then position ourselves in a strong way to move forward in the future. And what are some of those things, Mr. President? I have a term and I use it all the time. I'm sure I've used it here. I call it the institutional scaffolding. We have to build the institutional scaffolding. If you think about it as a house that you're building, you come, you take up the ground, you put in the backhoe, you backfill it, you lay the foundation, and then you put on the ground floor, then you put up the walls on the outside, and if you decide you're going up 2 stories, you come behind, you put up the 2nd story, somebody comes behind, they put up the 3rd story. But Mr. President, each one is built on a previous level. The previous level on which that is built has to be able to support that which it is carrying. Otherwise it falls and it crumbles, and it is that kind of thinking that I'm referring to when I say that a strong economy and a strong commercial sector must be the basis on which we are able to do some of the social spending and the developmental spending that we all agree is critical. So what are some of the sectors of the future, Mr. President? What are those institutional frameworks, Mr. President? How do we get into questions of productivity and development for our people? And that is what brings me, Mr. President, into the detailing of our estimates. Mr. President, we have estimates of expenditure totaling $1.8 billion on average here in this amended document. We have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I believe the minister, senior minister, who is going to speak on his ministry, will outline what that involves. And then I'm going to focus on just a few issues within the various ministries before getting into spending some time on my own ministry. There are a couple of issues that we have to watch over the course of this financial year. COVID responses and recovery, that's going to be covered by the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Health, as you have heard from the Minister and his team, well, the Minister and the Minister of State and their team, there are a couple of critical issues that they are focusing on. COVID recovery, being able to keep our population safe, but they have also come and they have spoken in great detail, Mr. President, about how their estimates of expenditure are meant to be able to focus on the expansion and the transformation of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. You've heard about the new accident and emergency facility that is there and the work that is expected to be undertaken during the course of this financial year to further improve the functioning of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. We've heard, Mr. President, also about the transformations that are meant to take place at Harson's Point and how that facility is meant to also transition into a new incarnation, hopefully in what we expect to be at some point in time, inevitably, a post-COVID environment. But we've also heard from the Ministry of Health and Wellness, Mr. President, about the importance of not being a one-issue ministry. You've heard them speaking, Mr. President, about the importance of wellness. You've heard them speaking about the importance, Mr. President, of non-communicable diseases and placing important attention on how we manage non-communicable diseases. Mr. President, sometimes when I read the newspaper, I see the reports on the passing of Barbadian souls as a result of COVID-19. And each time I see that, I have to confess that I think how many people today, on the same day, passed on from a non-communicable disease? How many people are suffering from issues relating to diabetes? How many people are suffering from issues relating to cancer? How many people are suffering with issues relating to hypertension? And have we given enough attention to those people and those diseases and their families and those resolutions that are necessary as we should? And it is my pleasure to say, Mr. President, that the Ministry of Health has indicated in these estimates of expenditure that this year there will be a dedicated focus on NCDs, and you have seen the Prime Minister has allocated a dedicated minister in the Ministry of Health who will focus day-to-day attention on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and on the management of non-communicable diseases in the Barbadian population. Mr. President, we also have spoken over the last 2 years about COVID, and I found myself unable to speak about COVID without also acknowledging that there is a mental health and mental wellness component to this entire conversation. Mr. President, the idea of people being in lockdown or being in isolation has exacerbated so many issues that are social, emotional, and mental in our country. Just last night, Mr. President, I was at a function and I was speaking to someone who was relaying the case of their loved one who was suffering from dementia. And they said to me that it was happening before COVID, but that first 5-month lockdown, their loved one went down so quickly in isolation, and only when they started to interact again did they see any kind of leveling off. Now, that is their non-medical assessment. But in their view, and in the view of so many people, the notion of isolation, the notion of non-connections to people, not being able to hug and touch your loved ones, has created a mental wellness challenge that Barbados must and is going to face under the umbrella and the leadership of the Ministry of Health, and they have given that undertaking in these estimates and in the other place when they spoke on the emphasis in these estimates. Mr. President, we have here with us in this House, in this chamber, a minister who is going to speak when it is their turn on the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, and those include health issues as well. And Minister Monroe Knight is now in the office of the Prime Minister, and she is going to be speaking when it is her turn on the issues relating to the SDGs. But here's what is also happening, Mr. President. Globally, as the world has dealt with COVID-19, and as we've dealt with global recession, and as we've dealt with all of the global challenges that countries are facing, the ability of countries to meet the requirements, the targets that were set in every area, including in the SDGs, that is a critical area that we need to make sure we are focusing on. But also poverty reduction. Mr. President, I have responsibility for a sector that outside of government generates approximately 35,000 jobs directly, over 40,000 jobs indirectly. I'll talk about those people when I come to tourism. But if we are thinking only about a single sector, Mr. President, and we multiply that over the multiple sectors that have been so badly affected by COVID-19 and by all the things that have happened as a result of COVID-19, including businesses closing, people unable to be paid and having to be severed, there are thousands of people who were badly affected over the course of the last 2 years, for whom loss is a real thing, Mr. President, for whom isolation is a real thing, Mr. President, and for whom mental wellness and their own sense of well-being is something that is critical to this government. Now, the Prime Minister has spoken, and she is now internationally renowned for her speech in Glasgow on climate. You have heard her speaking here and abroad on the issues relating to climate change. She has made it clear that Barbados, a small, developing state, has to now put itself in a position where we mitigate the impact of climate change and that we integrate into our development planning the issues that are critical to construction, rehabilitation of our coastal areas, that we put them into our construction and the development of new infrastructure, and that every single aspect of our being, including our utilization of our resources, so fisheries, for example. And I'm giving a very high-level overview, Mr. President, of what some of these key issues are, so that when I begin to go into the specifics of the estimates, you have context for why they are important and what we hope to do as an administration. Mr. President, under my ministry, which is where I want to start my own substantive presentation over the course of today, you have a dedicated head of expenditure where we are speaking, Mr. President, to 4 main priorities. 1, the management and regulation of licenses, supporting investment strategies, education awareness, as well as tourism promotion. We have a number of programs, Mr. President, under the ministry, and I want to go through many of them with you in some detail. Mr. President, let's start first and foremost with the National Tourism Program. National Tourism Program is a program that is funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, $20 million allocated to the National Tourism Program. Under that program, Mr. President, there are a number of key elements that we're looking forward to sharing with Barbados over the course of the coming year. Those include, Mr. President, the rehabilitation of the National Trail. You're going to see that started over the course of the last year. We also are seeing, Mr. President, the rehabilitation of the car park and the Barbados Museum over by the UNESCO Heritage Area. You're also going to be seeing the rehabilitation of the old Town Hall building opposite St. Mary's Parish Church in Bridgetown, and those things are all going to be expected during the course of this financial year, and they are allocated in the estimates of expenditure. Mr. President, there is one area that we have not spent a lot of time on historically, and I want to spend some time on it today. Mr. President, when we talk about tourism, we talk about planes and aircraft and so on, we don't think about aviation. In the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport, we have responsibility for both the Bridgetown Port and the Grant Adams International Airport. And I want to spend some time today talking about how we are going to anchor 2 new growth sectors out of those 2 facilities. 2 new growth sectors out of those facilities. What are those two new growth sectors, Mr. President? Aviation services. Let's start there. We have all across the Caribbean, and certainly here in Barbados, we talk about luxury tourism, for example. We have a luxury segment that is all along our west and our platinum coast of the island. The yield on our west coast is significantly greater than the yield on our south coast. And so we have to be able to rationalize what are the upstream and the downstream revenue opportunities, Mr. President, that can be derived from that higher yield. Mr. President, we have made the determination that when we mapped our sector, that a number of those persons are coming in the front of the plane, upper class cabins, or alternately, there is a growing trend of private charter planes coming into Barbados. They come, they bring their guests, they want to set up fixed base operations here in Barbados, but they also need ancillary services. And what are those ancillary services, Mr. President? In the development of a national aviation strategy, which we have just completed the draft of and we will take up to Cabinet momentarily, and is here included in the estimates of expenditure in one specific area, we have estimated that this year we could see for the first time maintenance and repair operations as a new activity, new growth activity here in Barbados. We could see over the course of this financial year, Mr. President, and into the next 2023, the emergence of transshipment and cargo operations here in Barbados. Barbados happens to be the most southerly located destination in the region. We are, as a result, in negotiations actively with partners to bring both cargo from sea and from air to hub and to transship through Barbados, because that is a growth opportunity as well. In addition to that, there are partnerships even with our productive sectors, including with agriculture, so that we are able to produce elsewhere in the region, ship into Barbados, and ship elsewhere throughout the region as well. Those are some of the international transportation initiatives that we expect to net new revenue and new growth opportunities and new jobs for Barbadians over the course of the coming years. We have projected that, Mr. President, out to 2025. But what we're hoping to be able to see, Mr. President, first and foremost this financial year, and it is included in these estimates, the creation for the first time in Barbados' history of a civil aviation authority. The transitioning away from a civil aviation department into a civil aviation authority, and with that transitioning during the course of this financial year, which is earmarked to then come into effect from April 1 of this year, this financial year, it is included in our estimates, you will have, for the first time, a solid march being undertaken into a new ICAO audit heading into 2023, and with the completion, we hope, of that audit having attained 70%, Mr. President, as the threshold, we will move immediately onwards to engage with the FAA on the attainment of Category 1 status for Barbados' international airport. What that means, Mr. President, is that with the attainment of Category 1 status for the Grantley Adams International Airport, we can attract flag carriers, we can take control over our upper airspace once we have the regulatory management framework in place. That bill is presently in draft. And then ultimately, Mr. President, we can, and we're hoping to move urgently towards the establishment of an aircraft registry in Barbados. Now, all that I have described is matched by what is being undertaken in the Bridgetown port on the maritime side. We are equally in the Bridgetown port. Now, here in these estimates, we do not include there's no transfer from the central government over to the Bridgetown port, so you don't see that included in here, except as it relates to the Civil Aviation Department, but we are expecting to mirror what we have done with the Civil Aviation Department and the creation of a new framework at the Bridgetown port, and to have during the course of this financial year a new ships registry, and to expand the cargo operations of the Bridgetown port so that Barbados becomes both an air and a sea hub, and we improve our efficiencies. Mr. President, I also want to spend a moment going through a couple of key things that are here in the estimates that I think are important for the public to pay some attention to, and it is also under our National Tourism Program. Now, under the National Tourism Program, Mr. President, we have had a number of what we call environmental, social, and economic studies being undertaken. Now, these studies have been critical for the purpose of ensuring that we are in a position to effectively implement the programs that have been agreed to under the various components of the project. What are some of these components? One, there has been the investment in a partnership with MasterCard, which allows for us to have far more data access so that we're able to map persons who are traveling to Barbados, what they're spending on, what their experiences are looking like, and to be able to provide those revenue opportunities for local businesses to take advantage of. We have built up a database, Mr. President, that is also speaking on about collating that information to benefit average Barbadians in particular, who in particular are dependent on the tourism sector to be able to thrive. Now, quite a bit of work has gone into the development of our air transport infrastructure, and you see that here on the Head 27, air traffic management systems. Mr. President, it was an interesting thing for me to receive a call from someone a few months ago. They had called in on brass tacks and they wanted to make a recommendation. They said it was for over 30 years that Barbados had not had control over its upper airspace. It was managed from another country in the region. And we at the time said that we needed to understand what that meant and what the implications were. But Barbados did not have an the air navigation systems in place. We did not have a regulatory framework in place. And as such, for over 30 years, we have had this system in place and foregone the associated revenue, which has never come to Barbados. Once we are able to complete, and we have it in this financial year, we started to spend in the last financial year, and we have continued in this financial year. There are approximately, I think it's approximately $1.2 million over the course of this financial year for 4 dedicated consultants in the transformation of our entire air traffic navigation systems, air safety navigation systems, which will allow for Barbados for the first time again to take that control over our upper airspace and to benefit from the revenue derived therefrom. Those are among the things that you see here. They may look benign when you say air traffic management systems, but when you understand the implications of why they are in there, Mr. President, then you understand why it makes sense and what is so important in terms of its allocation. Mr. President, we have a number of hotel properties that have benefited from a program called BEST. The BEST program is a $300 million program under the last financial year, and during that financial year, we had 2,700 odd persons who were re-engaged under the program, and just under 50 businesses, including hotels, car operators, and so on, who came into the program as well. This financial year, Mr. President, we are going to be looking to see how we treat to a continuation of the BEST program, specifically now in 2 areas, and you heard the Prime Minister mention it in the other place, digitalization and connecting it to our sustainability agenda. So you're going to see some of that taking place. In terms, Mr. President, of there's 2 other areas in here that I want to spend a moment on in some detail, Mr. President. This is on the Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc. in particular, and then I want to come to one other entity. Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc., as you know, was taken off of central government's books right before 2018, and then we were deriving revenue for that entity to finance its operations from the airport charges that were coming in from departing passengers. That is expected to continue, Mr. President, and we're hoping that with the traffic that we have seen over the last winter season, the winter season so far, we're heading into April shortly, and so we'll be coming to the end of the winter season, but I'll tell you this. What we have seen so far, Mr. President, is that most of our partners are reporting an above expectation winter season for 2022, 2021, 2022. In 2019, it was a record year. In 2021, 2022, 2020, it flatlined. And in 2021 to 2022, we have seen a record year. So, for example, Mr. President, for the period January to February 2022, we saw over 64,000 visitors coming to the island, 64,000. That, Mr. President, for those of you who are mathematicians among us, is a 61,000 person increase over the corresponding period for the last year. So if we saw 64,000 this year in January, February, and it was a 61,000 increase, you would understand how 2020, 2021 was a really bad year. People simply were not traveling, people were not moving, and our sector was in collapse. This year, we have seen average occupancy rates go from lowest 68%, in some instances as high as 98%. If you were to try to find a room anywhere on the South Coast, Mr. President, anywhere on the West Coast, Mr. President, if you were to try to find a villa, Mr. President, or an Airbnb, you would struggle. The country is, and I think I remember saying this on Christmas Day, there are no rooms in these inns. The country has been full. So we are seeing increased volume, but what do we have to do now? We have continued to see our U.S. market performing extremely strongly. Our U.S. market continues to have the most number of seats, even though our U.K. market constitutes 50.6% of our total arrivals. What does that mean, Mr. President? It means that we have now been looking at diversification. And so you're seeing over the course of the winter season, traffic also coming out for the first time out of Amsterdam, out of the Netherlands, also coming out of Frankfurt, out of Germany. And I was pleased to announce just earlier today at our State of the Industry press briefing that we will be returning Panama's travel. Panama will return on COPA in June of this year. So we are having Europe, the US, the UK, and we are in active negotiations with countries even further afield in the Gulf region and in the African region, on the African continent. And so the expectation, Mr. President, is that the revenue earning and the foreign exchange generating sector, that is tourism, is going to be positioned to recover not just as a growth sector on the basis of arrivals and occupancy rates, Mr. President, but what I described this morning in my State of the Industry briefing and what we've been discussing in our ministry as part of a new visioning, the business of tourism, Mr. President. We have set targets for ourselves by 2025. Where do we want to be? We've set targets by 2030. Where do we want to be? What is the percentage increase on a yearly basis that we need to be able to accomplish in order to reach our targets by 2030? How many seats increases do we need to be able to have over time? And I've said to my team during the course of this week, we had a retreat on Monday, Tuesday, and I said to them, we have had a habit historically of looking at arrival numbers and reporting arrival numbers. And I said to my team, I'm not interested in arrival numbers on their own. Arrival numbers only make a difference to any of us in the business of policy making if they, first of all, have been based on projections, if you've matched your marketing, you've done your competitor analysis, you know who else is competing for the same segments of the market with you, you have put your money where your money needs to be, and you know where you're picking up, where you're lagging, you spend more money in those areas, and then you look backwards at arrivals. But I don't need arrivals on their own. Arrivals on their own don't mean anything to us. And so we're rationalizing what we do and how we spend the money that we earn from this airport service charge in order to be able to attract and market the destination. Earlier this morning, I also launched our summer destination campaign for Barbados under the BTMI. We are presently all across the world over the course of the coming week going to be rolling out our summer campaign in every source market. We are going after young professionals, working professionals, families with 2 children, 3 children, but activities have to match those targets, Mr. President. We're going after the wealthy clientele because they come, they stay longer, they buy property, and we are looking at how we convert a short stay visitor, Mr. President, into a long stay investor because we are about the business of tourism. We are no longer looking, Mr. President, at narrow arrival numbers. We're also, Mr. President, working with our partners yesterday, and I gave the example earlier today. I went yesterday to Kensington Oval briefly and had I did not consume any of it at the time, Mr. President. I was on the job, but there was a partnership with Frosties, local ice cream company, and local rum manufacturers. And they were working together to be able to put together a brand new product, and they piloted it yesterday, what we call a lolly. And it was a lolly frozen treat with Cockspur Silver and Mount Gay in another one. And they were going like hotcakes. They were giving away free samples, and we would know that the guys in the party stand were happy. Happy. So that was one of the things that we saw yesterday. But I raised that example to say to you, Mr. President, that tourism has to be about the multiplier effect and creating new opportunities for goods and services to have a broader reach. And so we started discussions with all of our partners on how we would partner to develop products and services in our overseas markets. So fine. So source markets are coming to us, 1.2 million visitors a year. That's good. That's fantastic. But how do we link that to continuous spend when they go back home? That's where we're focusing our attention. And so we've begun the process of developing what we now have called a tourism accelerator program, which prepares us to link our tourism product and our visitors on island with the sale of goods and services like lollies that are using Barbadian rums as part of the process. How do we get those into the export market, having introduced visitors to them here in Barbados? So we're talking about the business of tourism, Mr. President. We have set ourselves a target that by 2025, we should have 10 businesses establishing a commercial presence here in the Caribbean region. And we set a target conservatively of 10 publicly, but my team knows that, just like my boss, that is a much higher target in reality. But 10 businesses well established. We've talked about this before, Mr. President. Where are the next sandals of the Caribbean coming from? Can they come from Barbados? Where is the next Caribbean brand coming from that is globalized? Can it come from Barbados? And if so, why not? And so we have to be able to position the tourism sector to be about more than just arrivals on island. We are doing the business of tourism, Mr. President. We're also working with our partners in our overseas markets to ensure that we have the opportunity to connect diasporic products in our overseas offices. And what do I mean by that? There's so many Barbadians who live in the diaspora. People who come to Barbados, and if we go back to where we were during the pandemic and how people were isolated and just staying in their homes, Mr. President, we could not figure out how people stayed in their homes and wanted to come to Barbados and were calling us up or messaging and going, and the number of likes and hits on our website during that period were incredible. And so we need to be able to sell Barbados without people even having to come to Barbados. So there is a constant source of revenue for small business providers and for business people that are domiciled here as a result of foreign exchange earned overseas. And what do I mean by that? Mr. President, on all of our computer screens, we've got these really great images. I have to confess, I'm a little boring, so mine is just the generic one that comes with the screen. But people go out of their way and they purchase these amazing screensavers and they have them on their screens, Mr. President. When people get up in the mornings and they're on their Pelotons or their treadmills and so on, I confess that's not me either, but there are people who do it and they're excitedly running on their treadmill and they are watching an image on their screens and they're transported into somewhere else. Why are people not running and transported into Animal Flower Cave, the top of North Point, up in St. Lucie, and experiencing the beauty of Barbados? Why are they not running through virtually Welchman Hall Gully and earning Barbados and Barbados earning revenue from people having experiences? And so we are also developing a revenue opportunity out of that, Mr. President. Now, in the Bridgetown Port, also not listed here because it's revenue, we will see an expanded capital works program, the Shallow Draft Marina, and I use this because it's connected to tourism, and I did speak about the sector that we're going after in terms of luxury tourism, Mr. President. We are seeing an expanded Shallow Draft Marina that is going to attract an additional number of yachts and an additional number of pleasure craft coming to Barbados, and those boats and pleasure craft coming to Barbados will also be able to benefit from yet another project, which is $3 million in this instance, Mr. President, for a boat haul-out facility. Can you imagine, Mr. President, that For as long as we have been a boating community, we have not had a commercial haul-out facility here, that people were still having to take boats down to other countries in the region, and Barbados was losing that revenue because we did not have the capacity to do it here. Mr. President, we are correcting that in this administration. And we are developing, and we've earmarked the land. That work is expected to be completed during the course of this financial year, and we should have a brand new boat haul-out facility that allows the fishing fleet and the pleasure craft alike to have their investments here in Barbados and to be able to create jobs and opportunities for people in new disciplines. Mr. President, there are a couple of other things that I want to just bring some attention to in the course of my presentation, because I'm not going to use my full allocation of time, but I want to speak to one of those things coming from the Ministry of Home Affairs because it's connected to tourism. Mr. President, in the Home Affairs Ministry, under the Immigration Department, there's a $1.6 million project that is allocated in these estimates of expenditure. And it speaks to a number of things, including a passport design upgrade and the implementation of a disaster recovery system, as well as a new passport design process. Now, Mr. President, this is important to the tourism sector because we have been working very closely with the Immigration Department on the development of a new ED form, version 2, that is expected to emerge very shortly, and in the coming months, perhaps a little later, you will see a version 3. We want to see touchless travel in the Grant Lee Adams International Airport, Mr. President. Seamless travel. And that means that our documents have to be smart documents, and our equipment has to be digital. Over the course of the last few weeks, Mr. President, we transferred from the Grant Lee Adams International Airport to the Immigration Department 57 kiosks valued at over $4 million to the Immigration Department to have them take responsibility for processing passengers in the Advanced Passenger Information System and on arrival in Barbados through the Grant Lee Adams International Airport. Mr. President, with the changes that have been made to the arrivals process, we are now averaging from disembarkation of the aircraft all the way through clearance of immigration. If you've completed your BIM safe, it's now taking approximately 9 minutes to clear the Grant Lee Adams International Airport until you go to collect your bags. And if you have not completed your BIM safe in advance, we are averaging 11 to 12 minutes to clear up until immigration. This is a significant transformation of the Grant Lee Adams International Airport experience, Mr. President, and a lot of it is driven by the incorporation of technology and the transformation of our processes. But we're not stopping there, Mr. President. This process here is going to allow for automated passport control kiosks and the software network infrastructure, as well as the maintenance. It's costed at $968,000, and over a 3-year period, mapped out over these estimates, you will see the upgrading of the kiosks and the transformation of the work which has already been done in the Immigration Department at the Grant Lee Adams International Airport to bring those times down even further. We already have the Advanced Passenger Information System. We have the Advanced Customs Information System. And you are going to be seeing, certainly on the Bridgetown Port side, because you know I'm always comparing the two entities, the Bridgetown Port and the Grant Lee Adams International Airport. You also have the Maritime Single Window, also in implementation at the Bridgetown Port. And as such, we are pushing very aggressively to have clearances. Now, I want to speak about the cost of living, Mr. President, as it is connected to the port and clearances, because those are critical issues that I know Barbadians are dealing with. Mr. President, we now have a system in the Bridgetown Port where there are multiple agencies that are involved in clearances: Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, Plant Quarantine, EPD, Customs, and all of those agencies function under a different regime. We have created, Mr. President, under the umbrella of the social partnership, a port efficiency subcommittee that reports into the social partnership on how these entities are interfacing. This is a committee that was established in 2019, and it continues to function to date. We have just implemented a series of transitions, and in the Ministry of Business Development in particular, You heard the Minister Simmons, speaking about the electronic single window that is going to be introduced with support from the Caribbean Development Bank. That too, and the establishment of this project unit, those things are also included in these estimates of expenditure, Mr. President. And so we're looking to make sure that we're able to expedite clearances of people, expedite clearances of cargo, and in so doing, bring the cost of doing business in Barbados down, moving things faster through, but also making life easier for people. Mr. President, I want, in my final comments, to raise two issues. Those two issues, Mr. President, relate to the Grantley Adams International Airport and those two issues relate to the Grantley Adams International Airport, Mr. President, and the Harson's Cave. Harson's Cave is in these estimates, Mr. President, because there was a pre-existing loan that you have seen there that central government has undertaken responsibility for. But Harson's Cave, as you know, went out to concession in 2020, and it is being managed presently by a third party, Chukka Caribbean. There is a management agreement in place, and the government of Barbados is able to generate from that concession agreement benefits that come as a result of that agreement in place. Harson's Cave now has undergone a $6 million renovation and a rehabilitation project. The caves are open and have been open since July last year, but we have now taken one attraction and converted that one attraction into 5 attractions, Mr. President. So there is expanded scope and scale at what is Harson's Cave. What are some of those additional attractions, Mr. President? We now have a bungee jump. Well, I'm not even sure if it's called a bungee jump, but you kind of jump down and you're suspended in here. You have a swing bridge, a bridge that is hanging over the gully 80 feet down. You've got this gully that is heading over. I don't know how, but some people may enjoy that. You also have an infinity pool where the family can come and they can enjoy the swimming pool, but you also have a rum museum and a rum tasting center. And so you can come, you can enjoy Barbadian rum, the home of rum, and they are partnering with one of our local manufacturers to be able to have that done there. So it has now gone from a 2-hour experience into a whole day experience at Harson's Cave, covering a range of different things. There's also a bird aviary, and a monkey park, also in Harson's Cave. So you've got a range of things happening there. Mr. President, that arrangement at Harson's Cave is no different than the arrangement that we are currently negotiating for the Grantley Adams International Airport. The Grantley Adams International Airport is not being sold. It is not being given away. The Grantley Adams International Airport, like the Harson's Cave facility, is in negotiation for a concession agreement for a management company to run it. Now, what is that management company meant to do, Mr. President? That management company, on the basis of where we are now, is expected, and we have 13 bidders who came into the process and who are still interested in the process, 12 who have committed to going forward. And those companies, Mr. President, are from all around the world, and the minimum threshold, and I remember when in the last term I brought this legislation here and we spoke about it, I gave details on how the management company needed to meet certain critical thresholds. You needed to have an airport turnover of over a certain number of million a year. You needed to have had a certain revenue base of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And so that meant that only experienced operators were likely to come and be able to apply for a concession to run Grantley Adams. I'm proud to say that we have been able to attract bids from the top airports and airport operators around the world. And we are expecting, Mr. President, that over the course of the life cycle of this agreement, we will have an investment in the following capital works programs. One, we will see an investment in capital works that focus on the enclosure of the departure hall at Grantley Adams International Airport, which, as we know, is now open. It rains and things can happen. So that entire area is earmarked for enclosure. We will also have an expansion of the commercial areas at Grantley Adams International Airport so that there are greater opportunities for commercial revenue and for commercial generation. We are going to see investments in safety and environmental and security arrangements at the airport, which will include things like wastewater treatment, incineration facilities. You will also include things that will cover the Barbados Fire Service, for instance. Those kinds of things are all contemplated within the arrangements. The security, the access control, and the regulatory management of our airport remains with the government of Barbados. They are not transferred to a third party. The commercial aspects, the aeronautical and the non-aeronautical aspects, they are the ones that are transferred to the concessionaire, but Barbados retains control and ownership of our international airport, and we retain control of the regulatory management under the new Civil Aviation Authority. Mr. President, I spent some time on my own estimates, largely because we were not participating in the well exercise in the other place. And so I wanted to take some time to go through, for the benefit of Barbadian public, what we were proposing to do in our ministry. But I want to take the time to say at the same time, Mr. President, that all across every other ministry, just like we asked the country to do, there were wants and needs. There was highly desirable, must have, would be nice to have. And we have all had to prioritize to ensure that we had the things that we must have. The things that would be nice to have, certainly I have a bit of an advantage because I have a revenue generating ministry that is meant to say, if we can make more money, if we can generate more revenue for the country, then there will be more access to capital for the wants and the things that we would like to have and the things that we would like to be able to see. And so that responsibility rests on all of our productive sectors to be transformational, to be innovative, to be able to treat to the needs of those who are commercially oriented, as well as to treat to the man on the street who wants to be able to benefit also from an investment made by this country. We have to be able to ensure, Mr. President, that in these estimates of expenditure, as we look across every single ministry, from social services to productive sectors to regulatory management to legislative reform, that we are able to see that we have a comprehensive budget allocated for the next financial year. Is it going to give you everything you want? It didn't give me everything that I wanted. It's not possible. The backward view that I started out with, by talking about all the things that have happened over the last 2.5 years, those things will mitigate our ability to do all of the things and to have all of the things that we want. Just like in our households, we choose sometimes what we're going to go forward with now, what we'll hold for until a little later, and what we'll come back to when we have some more flex room and we have some more room in our budget. That's what our country is doing, Mr. President. We're making sure that there are jobs. We're making sure that we generate growth so people can earn a living. We're making sure that we position our future in a world, Mr. President, where small island developing states have limited space to maneuver. And they're fighting against North and South and caught between North and South, Mr. President, and we have to carve out a space for ourselves. I can only say, Mr. President, that over the course of the coming days, as we continue to debate these estimates, that I am looking forward to hearing the robust contributions of all of the members of this honourable chamber, in particular those who have an interest in productivity and economic development, speaking about the things that we would wish to have raised and elevated to national consciousness, and I will have an opportunity when we close this debate to respond to any questions which are raised. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill is read a second time.
Senator Drake.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to start this debate by saying this is the third year that I am sure that the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs had had the painstaking task of trying to put together these estimates that outline the projected revenues and expenditure, because, Mr. President, if we are all being honest, there's such a level of volatility, a high level of volatility in our environment at the moment, planning a year in advance, in some respects, almost seems absurd, because from day to day, from event to event, the world is changing so rapidly that we cannot sometimes see when there is a major shock just around the corner. Sir, and I say that because we're not even, we haven't even completed the first quarter of the year, and the global economic projections from December 2021 have significantly changed. Mr. President, the Bank of America already has lowered the projections for the gross domestic product coming out of the United States of America just from 2021. They've now said that the economy will contract by 0.3 percentage points, and we're also seeing reduced estimates coming out of Europe. Mr. President, even here in Barbados, the central bank, on January 27th, just 6 weeks ago, in their reporting to the country on the financials and the economic affairs of Barbados for 2021, stated that there are multiple scenarios for growth, but they are optimistic, absent the reimposition of travel restrictions or the deepening of the supply chain disruptions, or, Mr. President, the central bank noted, or significant geopolitical shocks. There is the potential, they were very cautious in what they said. There is the potential, Mr. President, for a robust recovery leading to double-digit growth in 2022. And, sir, we are here just 3 months into the year facing a war that has severe implications if it is prolonged or escalated, could change life as we know it here, not just in Barbados, but on planet Earth. Sir, global inflation rates due to the invasion of Ukraine have hit record highs. We know that the inflation rate has now hovered around 7%, and that has had an impact, obviously, on the price of things like oil, subsequently energy, and because Ukraine and Russia are, quote-unquote, the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, the impact that it has had on the price of food. And, sir, we've heard a number of these things already. But what I want to also say is, if the global rate of inflation is now 7%, I know a lot of Barbadian consumers complained about the prices during 2020 and 2021, but the inflation rate rose to 3.2% from 2.9%, Mr. President, in 2020. So between 2020 and 2021, the rate of inflation only went up by 0.3%. Think about that. And yet in our pockets, it felt a lot higher. And we are talking about rates globally that have increased by 7%. Sir, and it is in that type of context that I am talking about uncertainty, Mr. President, where the 21st century will have existential challenges, where the rules of the game are in flux and we are seeing geopolitical events, that there's a clear fight for and shifting of power happening across the globe. And one of the scenarios that we have to contemplate in our minds and how we do business is, what if the center of the world shifts east? That is one of the scenarios, Mr. President, we have to contemplate. Sir, this hostile global environment that Barbados and other small island open economies have to face, particularly as it relates to the rise in inflation, is essentially stripping away the Barbadian consumer and our households the ability to afford basic goods and services. And, sir, from the onset of COVID, a once honorable member of this chamber in a private conversation said to me, "Young Drakes, it is corned beef and biscuit time. It is corned beef and biscuit season." That was the former Prime Minister. You can't hear me? Oh, they can't hear me? Oh. The former Prime Minister of Barbados, the Right Honourable Owen Arthur, he said to me on the onset of COVID, "It is corned beef and biscuit season." Well, if at the beginning of COVID, Mr. President, that was the type of season that we were in, and 3 years later, we have had the battering that we received in 2021 from volcanoes that we have no ownership to, with the level of ashfall here in Barbados, thanks to Lasso Flare. The freak storm that nobody can even tell us what was the cause of it. I don't think we've had an explanation for that. And then we had Hurricane Elsa. And then we started to come out of the dark. We started to seem as though we got our footing. COVID seemed like it was starting to reside and everybody was ready to get back outside. People planning crop over costumes, Mr. President. People were planning crop over costumes. And Mr. President, we rang in the new year, and I am sure that most of us who turned on the news that morning, I had to get a phone call because I've made an effort, Mr. President, to limit the amount of news that I consume, just for my own mental health. I got a call saying Russia has invaded Ukraine. Mr. President, if there was a difficult time, now is the time. And that is why I say I do not envy those in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs trying to grapple with how we allocate resources. And sir, I say that because this debate is essentially formally about the Appropriations Bill 2022, and it is contextualized by the estimates and the budget. And sir, a few things stand out to me when I look at the estimates. So the first is our fiscal position. Sir, the first thing that I noted was the underestimation of our fiscal deficit, which was approved in the last financial year, or this financial year that is being completed. So the amount that was projected was we would run a fiscal deficit of about $506 million. That is now revised to $869.3 million, an increase, Mr. President, of $363 million. Sir, and I am sure that a lot of those funds were spent to deal with all of the surprise events that came along the way in 2021 that the government had to deal with. Because in the event that the society needs intervention to ensure that people are kept safe, the government must intervene. That is the role of the state, Mr. President. Sir, and if anything has taught us about 2021, it is that there is clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, a direct impact of natural disasters and climatic events on our fiscal position. Because that $363 million of increase, Mr. President, is just shy of 4% of GDP. 4%, not the entire fiscal deficit. The increase is 4% of our GDP. Sir, this year's fiscal deficit is projected to be $867.3 million. And based on the global events that we are seeing, I am sure, sir, that these may be conservative estimates. We still have the hurricane season that is around the corner to come. We do not know what awaits us then. And as I said, if the war in Ukraine either further escalates or is prolonged, that will have a direct impact on government's ability to collect revenue and the amount of expenditure that it will have to put out. Sir, Barbados has now ran deficits since 2020, the onset of COVID, upwards of almost $1 billion each year. In 2020 to 2021, we ran a fiscal deficit of $948.3 million. In 2021 to 2022, we ran, as I said, $869.3 million. And then this year, Mr. President, we are projected to run a fiscal deficit of $867.3 million. Sir, in those 3 years, government shortfall on revenue in relation to expenditure has been $2.6 billion. And that is the context by which the leader of government business just said, we can't do everything. Because when you run these types of deficits, and then you have to turn around and finance them, Mr. President, you have to start to pull out the needs and set aside the wants, because it would be in poor fiscal management for any government in this type of situation to have a free-for-all, Mr. President. Sir, what we also saw is that the profile of the financing to cover the deficit has shifted from in the past from being primarily financed by mostly domestic sources, from domestic sources, and shifting to foreign financing. Sir, since COVID, the average of the debt financing has come from project-based loans. 88% has been covered from international financial institutions. This year, if you look at the Table 8, the Summary of Government Operations and Financing 2022 to 2023, sir, that table seeks to outline that the financing, rather than being heavily sourced from foreign institutions, is now trying to shift where government is anticipating that it will raise financing from foreign sources of $466 million and $401 million from domestic financing, of which $125 million, Mr. President, is expected to come from Treasury bills and $276 million from other sources. And sir, that $276 million is where I draw the question mark. Because in the environment that we are living in, I am not sure where government plans to get that $276 million from. It was said to me by somebody who has extensive experience in central banking that it would have to come from the central bank. I don't know. I know right now the local market, there's not a lot of appetite for government financial instruments. So we have to ask the question, if domestic financing does not make up for the shortfall, where is the financing going to come from? Sir, and this is the kind of environment that we create, a situation that produces a cycle where you are running large deficits, not necessarily because of mismanagement, but because of external situations that have impacted your financial situation. But you're running large deficits, financing them from foreign sources where when it has to be repaid in hard currency foreign exchange, but is then being used in the domestic space for imports and being used from balance of payment support financing. Let me go again. You're running large deficits, that is being used in the local economy. So you're getting money, you're financing your deficit, it is being used in the local economy, but a lot of those activities take up imports. You need imports to do a lot of the activities, like the paper, everything is imported. But what you're using to buy the things that is happening in the local economy, the foreign exchange reserves that we talk about, those are also borrowed funds. So it is a very tricky, vicious cycle, Mr. President, that we find ourselves in, that the only way out of it, truth be told, is what the leader of government business spoke about this morning. It has to be through economic growth. Because a country as small as Barbados, where the real GDP, Mr. President, is only $7 billion, your total liabilities are $13 billion, and you're running deficits year on year that are just about $1 billion, we're going to run ourselves in problems very shortly, Mr. President. And that is the harsh reality. Somebody asked me, sir, before the Prime Minister made her statements on Monday as it relates to the budget, you know, what you think we can get a little ease? I saw the numbers. I said, well, I won't hold your breath. But I'm going to get to the measurements soon, Mr. President, that were outlined in the budget. Because, Mr. President, I know that the government is competent enough to look at these numbers and hold strain. Because we went through a season where we had to produce primary surpluses, and the government got it done. The financial discipline was there to get it done. People were still able to live. Some complained, yes. I had issues with some of the measures that were brought. But the fiscal discipline was there. The macroeconomic bedrock was there for the government to improve its macroeconomic position. And I know that the government, given all that it has gone through, is not satisfied with having to then, in a situation like we are in now, just run away with expenditures. I know. They can't do it. We as a society and a country, Mr. President, we cannot do it. So the second area that I want to bring to the Chamber's attention is our debt service. That is how much money we pay out to the people that we already owe. Sir, the debt service, the amount of money that we pay out to the people that we owe. Financial institutions, private individuals, if they've taken up instruments, etc., on the loan payments that we've taken out. So in this upcoming fiscal year, the financial year, the interest and amortization payments are expected to increase by 22% to $954 million, or 8% of projected GDP for this year. So that $954 million is made up of interest payments alone, totaling $491 million, and amortization payments, which is the principal, $480 million. So I just noted the deficit is almost up to $1 billion. The debt service alone is $954 million. When you start to think about these numbers and then you look at the GDP of $7 billion, you get a little angst. You have to have a little angst, because you then realize you have to do what you can to get all of your economic activities firing on all cylinders as soon as possible. Mr. President, when we look at a debt service payment, it is 26% of our total expenditures. So 26%, or 26 cents in the dollar, out of all expenditures, goes aside just to pay and service the debt. That is the reality, Mr. President. And if you look at the revenue projections, $2.8 billion, and I'm using the revenue projections based on the cash basis, as is, not the accrual, as is. $2.8 billion, Mr. President. As a percentage of the revenues that government collects, the debt service represents 35% of those total revenues. So 35 cents of every dollar that government collects is represented by debt service, Mr. President. And if I go further, Mr. President, and I place it into the context of the amount of exports, the value of exports that Barbados has, the debt service represents 28% of our export value. That's the money that we earn now, Mr. President. And, sir, the general acceptable level for debt service to export ratio is between 20 and 25%. That is the acceptable level. That is when you're in a position that it can be said that, you can sustainably service your debt based on the money that you earn as a country. Sir, we are at 28%. This is the reality, Mr. President. We are now pushing on the upper limits as it relates to our fiscal deficits and our debt, Mr. President. Sir, and the question has to be, and I'm sure some people will say, but what are we spending on that we are running these large deficits? So when you go through the estimates, the two major line items in expenditure are personal emoluments at $780 million. That is, we have to pay people to come to work in the public service. $780 million, Mr. President. And then the second largest category, Mr. President, is the transfers to institutions or state-owned enterprises and individuals at $673 million. Those are the two largest expenditure items or categories. That is where a lot of our expenditure is being taken up. And, sir, year in, year out, we talk about the state-owned enterprises, and unfortunately, I did not get to hear a lot of the discussion that happened in the well of Parliament. But clearly, the leader of government business outlined that there are a number of initiatives that are supposed to be on stream. And I know coming out of the BERT program, there was a lot of transformation that was supposed to happen in our state-owned enterprises, that I'm sure that because of COVID, a lot of things were delayed. But as a matter, sir, of priority and urgency, I think that those reforms have to happen, not today, yesterday, because we are at a critical point in our public finance where we simply cannot carry the inefficiencies that come out of a lot of our state-owned enterprises. Sir, the leader of government business noted it, and I also have it in my notes, that there was a commitment, and now there's a legal obligation for most of these enterprises under the Public Finance Management Act, subsection 108, subsection 6, that talks about the annual reporting. And not just financial reporting in terms of the revenues being spent and the expenditure, but also non-financial performances, so that those organizations outline clearly what are their targets, what are their operational objectives, and, Mr. President, to then relay that information to the people of Barbados in a comprehensive way so that Barbadians can know that they're getting the value for money. Because you cannot be the second largest expenditure item and there is a black hole as it relates to the operations in some of these state-owned enterprises. Sir, and that brings me to my third point. And I spoke about it in the last estimates debate. And you and I had a conversation after that. And I want to reiterate it because Senator Cummins, the leader of government business, she spoke about it, but I don't even think she understood when she said, and I sat here and I commended her when she said it. There needs to be a fundamental fundamental reform on how we report on the operations of ministries and departments in terms of key performance indicators. Mr. President, again, year in, year out, we continue to spend hundreds of millions of dollars without the accurate and comprehensive reporting, so that Barbadians, not just a few who have the privileged information at hand, but so that Barbadians can track their money, because the money does not belong to select individuals. This is the money of the country. They are the ones who need to be informed of how their money is being spent. Sir, as part of this estimates debate, I think it would be highly instructive and useful for us to have an addendum to this estimates document that outlines each ministry's key performance indicators and progress made towards those targets to build in accountability into the system. Sir, we propose in the estimates and through the appropriation bill the monies allocated without explicitly stating in any great detail what are the key outputs for each ministry and department. Sir, bringing those individuals in the public sector to the well of Parliament is aimed, yes, at outlining explicitly how expenditure will be used, but sir, it has to be connected to the outputs that are expected from that money being spent. It has to be, Mr. President, because given the constrained economic situation that we find ourselves in this more challenging environment, sir, we cannot continue to talk about departments in vacuums, in partial knowledge, and in a situation where only a few persons may have an understanding of what is expected in a ministry and what are the outputs that are expected from those persons operating in the ministry. Sir, and why I say that? Because the cornerstone of any mature democracy, when we look at them, one of the cornerstones is accountability. And that accountability comes through the availability of data and information on the process so that it can be scrutinized, Mr. President. Sir, we live in a world where we cannot afford to do what we've always done and expect to survive. It will not happen. Sir, as a country, it's almost unconscionable. It is unconscionable to have almost $1 billion year in, year out because of external shocks. And if I go in to Broad Street now and I ask 10 Barbadians, what are the key outputs coming out of 2 or 3 ministries? They don't know. And they don't even know where to find the information. And I'm not saying the information isn't there, because Senator Cummings made an excellent presentation just now about what she is expected of her team. And I commend her for it, because that is the direction, sir, that we have to go. And I'm asking it to be a comprehensive document as an addendum to these estimates, so that Barbadians can go and look and see, okay, the Ministry of Agriculture, for instance, had 20 KPIs. Out of those 20, but they only attended to 2? Why is that? And then the debate in the well of Parliament can be based on whether you have reached your targets or not, and why. And that elevates the conversation of the estimates, Mr. President, because it brings clarity. There's no confusion, there's no vagueness, there's no ambiguity. You are confined to what you say you will do, how you will do it, and what are the key performance indicators as it relates to your ministry. Mr. President, I just spoke about the Ministry of Agriculture. But sir, I want to give an example because I don't want to stand here and say these things without giving an example. The Ministry of Agriculture has a number of strategic goals outlined. One of them is to increase innovation and productivity in the agricultural sector through applied research and development. Mr. President, what does that mean? What are they expected to do out of that strategic goal? I don't know. I can't find it in the estimates. I'm sure that the minister came in the well and said what some of those goals are. I even heard the Prime Minister talk about the number of black belly sheep in terms of the increase, I think 10,000 in the stock. But I had to hear it, by the way, in this speech that I now have to say, well, sir, I'm subject to correction. But sir, that should be in the estimates. If that is a key performance indicator of the ministry, it should be an addendum to the estimates. Because sir, if you're talking about the increase in innovation and productivity, I would expect things like the rate of technology, the penetration of technology in agriculture to be a key benchmark for the ministry. How many farmers are using technology? Small farmers are using technology. Are they using their smartphone? Are they using apps? Even if it's in terms of record keeping or bookkeeping. Are we patenting anything in the agricultural sector as it relates to innovation and new mechanisms to increase agricultural yield? I don't know. Sir, this is 2022. We have to elevate and mature the conversation and the way that we do things, particularly in the public sector. Sir, even if we say use the existing estimates just as is, if we say we're increasing innovation, which is research and development, it is a key part of stimulating, Mr. President, increased crop production, which is Program 160 under the Ministry of Agriculture. We have $12.2 million allocated for research and development as it relates to crops, flowers, and cotton research, which are sub-programs 0.16, 0.64, and 0.166. But in previous years, the monies allocated and the revised expenditure were $33 and $36 million. So, sir, how is it then that the strategic goal is to increase innovation and productivity, and less than half the amount that was spent in the last financial year and the revised amount is allocated this year? We spent $36 million last year, but this year in the estimates it's allocated at $12.2 million cumulative across those 3 sub-programs. But yet we say that food security and innovation is a priority, Mr. President. And I'm not saying that you can't be efficient. You use less resources, but you still get the same level of output. I'm not saying that. But based on the track record that I see within the estimates on the dollar amount, Mr. President, then something is wrong. Sir, we then have a strategic goal of improved food and nutritional security and food systems through increased output and market penetration of agricultural products. Easy, Mr. President. Key performance indicators, the volume of production, the share of high nutritional crops to all crop production, because we're not just talking about food security anymore, we're talking about nutritional security. So instead of how much lettuce we have, we're talking about kale. For those health conscious, know the difference. Kale is a highly nutritious crop in comparison to lettuce. And those are the kind of nuances so that we can build into those KPIs so that we can actually, instead of just saying things, we can track the progress, Mr. President. Things like the acreage of arable lands in production, the soil quality, the ratio of local to imported produce. Snap of a finger. And once we have the systems in place to track that data, Mr. President, we can then, with confidence, any Minister of Agriculture with confidence can point and say, I have done my job and my duty. It protects also the minister. This is not an exercise where you can come and say, well, the minister said he was going to do this and he didn't do that. He could easily point to the reporting and say, show me. The facts are, I have met my KPIs. So, and this is something that is done in the private sector across the board. It is commonplace. And in a country that does not have the resources anymore, Mr. President, any types of inefficiencies that we see, we have to find a way to hold ourselves accountable. That is what we want. That is why we moved to a republic. We said we were mature. We are removing ourselves from the colonial past. But you can't do that, Mr. President, and still want to speak in terms that are vague and ambiguous as it relates to the things that you're saying that you've done. And I will not take away from the administration's ability to point to what they've done in their manifesto. That is a separate conversation. I am talking about national progress. The two should be one and the same. But when you're talking about the machinery of the public service, they have to have a level of accountability now built into what they are doing. And sir, by including these metrics, I think it can only strengthen the estimates process going forward. Mr. President, those are my musings on accountability in the estimates and having a safeguard for the ministry, because as I said, if you can point to the work that you've done and you can say, I have made 50 or 75% progress on this particular metric, and this is why the other 25 or the outstanding amount has not been done. Barbadians are reasonable people. They just say, okay, you have more time, do what you need to do. But I am sure that year in, year out, if you come with subpar results, Mr. President, you will have to be held to the your feet will have to be held to the fire. You will have to tell Barbadians why their money is being allocated to that ministry or department, and you are failing to meet your KPIs. But sir, I want to move on to the budgetary measures. Sir, the budget, there are some people that have certain expectations. I was one where I felt that there wasn't a lot of wiggle room for the current administration. People were looking for a lot of ease. And there are many persons across Barbados who find themselves still trying to recover from COVID. They still have not gone back to work, and they are relying on the goodwill of family, the church, whatever other social support system that they may have. And as I said, in bringing the budget, government had to find a way to maintain the fiscal discipline so that the macroeconomic position was not further compromised, but find a way to ease the pressures that Barbadians were facing, with particular respect to the cost of living. And there were 4 main measures that sought to do so. The one was the capping on the VAT payable on gasoline. That measure has started already. The VAT payable on diesel, that has started already. The freight costs that will be capped at 2019 levels of US $73.50 per 20-foot container and US $8,000 per 40-foot container from March 15th, 2022 until March 31st, 2023 for, Mr. President, and that's why I've read out this third one, for the purpose of calculating customs duties. I've read that out, Mr. President. because they're persons who, when this measure went out, thought that government was capping the cost of freight, which is not so. It was the calculation that that freight cost had on the customs duty that was being capped. And then you had the zero-rated items in terms of personal and critical care items from April 1st. And sir, these measures are being put into effect to ease the pressures from the rising costs. And so I want us to remember that in 2019, one of the main things that government came into office and one of the main measures, the promises that were made, one of the main promises that were made was the removal of the NSRL to reduce the inflation in the following months. And sir, many people have said that when that NSRL was taken off, which was at a rate of 10% of all items coming into Barbados, when that measure was taken off, the prices didn't go down. But Mr. President, based on the data coming out of the Barbados Statistical Service, the prices did go down. It's just Barbadians didn't feel it in their pockets. Mr. President, the inflation rate, that measure went into effect the 1st of July, 2018. The inflation rate at the time was 5.5%. In August, it was 5.4%. In September, it was 5.2%. In October, 4.7%. In November, 4.2%. And by December, it was 3.7%. So, based on the basket of goods and how it is calculated in terms of the price increases, inflation did go down when the NSRL came off. But in theory, yes. In practice and based on the day-to-day activities of Barbadians, they will tell you no, Mr. President. And I say that to caution Barbadians in terms of the measures that are being proposed to ease the pressures. Because, Mr. President, remember I said the measure in relation to the freight costs will be capped on the 2019 levels for the purpose of calculating the customs duties. Mr. President, businesses are still going to have to pay the freight costs. They're still going to have to pay. And they're going to pass it along to the consumer. So yes, the savings may be in the customs duties that you've paid, but is that going to be proportionate to the level of inflation that we're going to see globally? Because for Barbadians to feel the savings, two things have to happen. The level of savings has to be that much higher than the rate of increase to the prices coming down the pipeline. Or two, the private sector in their benevolence, Mr. President, don't pocket the savings and put it on the profit line, but pass it on to consumers. So, Mr. President, you tell me, what is the most reasonable thing you think will happen? And I am not here to say that the private sector will do anything that is going to be detrimental to the consumers, but we know in Barbados, when a price goes on an item and Bajans still buy it, the likelihood of it coming down is slim to none, because the market is still consuming the item. So I caution Barbadians somewhat in thinking that these measures, they're going to see this drastic reduction when they go out to shop. Sir, we wait to see if these policy interventions will have a significant impact on the cost of living. That, Mr. President, is yet to be seen. Like most policies, when you implement it, there's an intention, and once it gets rolled out and implemented, Mr. President, then you know what the real results are. Sir, I question if there were other ways to ease the burden. If you have implemented and intervened at the level of the business community, because most of those measures, the measures, particularly the freight costs, is based on the business community passing on the savings. I question, Mr. President, if, which was long overdue, I question, Mr. President, if we could not have had a reduction in the rate of VAT in Barbados. Because the rate right now was a temporary one. It was never supposed to last this long. It was always increased with the intention it would go back to 15%. And so when I do some back of the hand maths, when you reduce the VAT from 17.5 to 15%, where it should be, it ought to be, and we would all like it to be, Mr. President, the government would have lost about $26 million. VAT receipts are in excess of $1 billion this year, projected for the financial year ahead. So I just question, Mr. President, if directly when the consumer purchases the item, they can automatically see the reduction in what they're paying, because they can easily say, well, if I was paying 17.5% in VAT, my bill would have been X amount. But no, I'm paying 15%, it is this amount, and I've saved this much money. And the consumer, who is the one feeling the pressures, could see directly the impact that a change or reduction in VAT could have on the price of the goods that they are purchasing. And remembering, and I could be wrong, Mr. President, those who know better and have better data than me, it would have costed the government $26 million. Sir, coming now to the pandemic levy, but specifically on the private individuals who earn $75,000 or more annually. By month, that is the $6,250. Again, I propose an alternative, and I don't know if this is something that could have been done. Sir, could we have, instead of taxing individuals on their income, look to institute the pandemic levy at a smaller rate, but on wealth assets? So instead of going directly into people's income flow, you target assets that are stock. So if, like Senator Boyce, who may have a fixed income deposit at the bank, and it has $250,000 or more in it, the government takes a very small percentage of that to finance or the shortfall it has in taken out from the reduction in VAT. So instead of interfering with Senator Boyce's, instead of interfering with Senator Boyce's direct flow of cash and the income that he has to pay for goods and services daily, you direct your tax or your levy to a stock of funds that are a reserve. Because those types of investments, Mr. President, are long-term investments that are there to weather the storm in the long run and give you a rate of return over a longer period of time, whereas your monthly income is there just to service every month your obligations that you have. Because, Mr. President, if you think about it a little bit more in terms of the levy, when you put that levy on the income of those persons, and I saw on Twitter, the Bird app, as we call it affectionately in the younger community, somebody had a breakdown of somebody who is a young professional working for $6,250. And when they took out for NIS, income tax, mortgage, the car note, insurance, I think the person was left with a disposable income of about $400. It wasn't $400? How much was it? A few $100s though. It wasn't $1,000. And that is the reality of many young professionals, Mr. President, across Barbados. That is the reality. You're living paycheck to paycheck. And Mr. President, no, I have not included the 2 children that you have to feed and provide for, because we all know that the population needs to increase. And unlike me that has not done my civic duties yet, there are people who have 2 and 3 children to support. And they don't get the child allowance anymore when they are filing their income taxes, no. So that has not been reintroduced. So that is why I'm saying, Mr. President, was there enough scope to look at assets and taxing assets that are stocked, they are reserved for those in society who have the wherewithal to pay a lower rate, but it will gain you a higher rate of return in terms of the amount of tax that you get back, because you're now looking at a wealthier set of individuals. So you're taxing things like fixed deposits that have hundreds of thousands of dollars in them. You're talking about personal trust, Mr. President. And if persons say, no, I don't like that idea, who are wealthy in our society, my next question then, Mr. President, would be, would you rather live in a society where people are hungry and the proportion of that society is growing daily? Their children are hungry, and as Bob Marley said, a hungry man, Mr. President, is an angry man. Would you rather live in that society? Would you rather pay that cost? Or would you take the safer route, where for a few months you are paying a tax on an investment that you have that is supposed to be long-term in nature anyway, that is supposed to give you a rate of return over a longer period of time, as opposed to persons in your society falling below the poverty line who now actively target, Mr. President, because we live in a society where we like to show off our conspicuous consumption. We have persons who, by way of the vehicle they drive, the homes they have, Barbados is too small, Mr. President, for the vulnerable to start targeting those who have the means and resources. We do not want to go down that route. And dare I interject into this debate, I have not even discussed, Mr. President, the amount of illegal firearms that are on our streets. And that is all I will say there, Mr. President. So, sir, I am just placing alternatives on the table, looking at the measures, particularly the pandemic levy on those who earn the $75,000 or more. Because if you're saying you're shielding those individuals and reducing or trying to reduce the costs by which they have to pay for a number of items, but yet at the same time taxing them, it almost seems counterproductive, Mr. President. To some degree, it seems counterproductive. And, sir, I really want us to think about those who have the means and the resources, like Senator Boyce, as I said, to think about the type of society that you want to live in and the ramifications that these higher costs are going to have on those who live below the poverty line, Mr. President. Desperate people do desperate things. And we have had the luxury of living in a society where, for the most part, those who have and those who don't have, or those who are less fortunate, can walk around freely in Barbados. And that is something we should not take for granted. We should not take for granted, Mr. President. Sir, I also want to make a plea for a particular section in our society who, based on other measures that have been placed in previous budgets, because I think it is important for them also to have a say or a request made. So those are the persons who work and make a livelihood in our fishing community. So fishers and boat owners, I am asking if there can be any discretion of the government to remove or at bare minimum reduce the fuel tax those in the fishing community pay. Mr. President, if we are saying that we want to ensure that the price of food, particularly local fish, sir, stays within the reach of the average Barbadian, I'm urging the government to see if they can find some relief for those in the fishing industry. Mr. President, the fuel tax was implemented to replace the road tax. Fishermen and the fishing community never paid road tax on fishing boats. That policy was not meant for them, Mr. President. Some in the fishing community, when you talk about the larger ice boats and the long liners, Mr. President, have seen increases in their operations of up to 5,000 to 8,000, not 500 to 800, $5,000 to $8,000 in increased expenses due to the increase in fuel. So if it is anybody, Mr. President, that is deserving of sharing the benefits and releasing some of the pressures, given the importance that they play in making sure that the Barbadian community has local fish, I am asking, Mr. President, if there can be any relief as it relates to the amount of fuel tax that was firstly a road tax being paid by those in the fishing community. And sir, I want to also say this. People will say, well, like everybody else, they gotta share the load, share the burden. That is fine. But I want us to remember, Mr. President, in the darkest hours, when we were all shut in, Mr. President, in our homes, the fishing community was out there working. And I don't know how many persons have ever been out fishing, but it is not a 9 to 5 sitting down in an office. You risk life and limb, Mr. President. You do. You do. You do. Yes, you risk life and limb, Mr. President, out there on those seas. And if it is that they are doing that to provide us with food, I think that some consideration has to be made for those individuals. And, Mr. President, they have shown that they have a heart, because I remember when we were in the throes of the pandemic, they were the ones who donated fish to some of the most vulnerable of our households. They played their part. And they are an essential part to this society, Mr. President. So I believe, Mr. President, it was incumbent on me to make that plea for them, because I have spoken to a number of them who have stated over and over and over, and I remember when there was consultations with the then Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Blue Economy, and I know that with the type of increases that are coming down the pipeline as it relates to the price of oil, and then the reflection that has on gas and diesel, a lot of them, Mr. President, cannot afford those price increases. But sir, I want to turn now to this issue, sir, of economic growth. And as I stated, the real GDP, which is GDP not in nominal terms, but taking into account inflation, Mr. President, is just about $7 billion, or accurately $6.9 billion, according to the central bank's last report. Sir, and I want to say that I have been trained mostly in mainstream economics, where a lot of the students are told, focus on growth. That is what will get you out of it. That will solve all your problems. Growth, trickle-down economics, trickle-down effects. Once the persons who have resources, the ones who have the capital, once they have the money, everything else will follow. And I've said to the former chamber, that type of thinking in relation to economics will die in the 20th century. Because the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that that type of structure, or capitalist structure, can no longer prevail in the 21st century. Mr. President, when you have growth that is not linked to people development and people empowerment, when it is not linked to the conservation, preservation, and regeneration of the environment, Mr. President, that growth then becomes a problem. Sir, and I am happy and I am pleased that this administration has sought to build economic growth based on what I heard coming out of the budgetary proposals on a platform of renewable energy. I am pleased, Mr. President, that we are trying to build momentum of economic growth based on renewable energy. Because for every dollar, Mr. President, saved is a dollar earned. Every dollar saved is a dollar earned, Mr. President. And that also builds in a level of resilience to the Barbadian economy that cannot be, Mr. President, underestimated. Because, Mr. President, for too long, small island developing states that are located in the tropics have had to be at the mercy of the international markets and the price of oil, and not knowing when those triggers will happen and the effect that it will have on our economies. And, Mr. President, it should not be that small states like Barbados that have sunshine, what is it, 362 out of 365 days in a year, you have sunshine. And you have countries in temperate climates who have a higher rate of renewable energy penetration than we do. Germany, a bitter cold season. And we don't hear enjoying sunshine, Mr. President, all throughout December to February and March. Sir, it cannot be. And so that is why I am happy that the vibrancy by which the Prime Minister spoke in terms of unlocking the deadlocks, in terms of the bureaucratic process of things like licenses and permits. There's no more time. The clock has struck 12 and started to tick again. This is a new age, Mr. President. And that is why I can stand here and I can say that I am happy that there seems to be a platform of growth that is being built around sustainability principles. Mr. President, it was noted in the budgetary speech that there are things like the financial instruments to ensure that Barbadians can invest and benefit from the 30-megawatt wind power plant by the Barbados Light and Power, prioritizing the Green Investment Bank, which has major implications for the level of investment that comes into Barbados and the type of investment. I've spoken already, Mr. President, about responsible investment. And sir, mobilizing the liquidity of those in the credit unions so that the members, which we know, sir, are usually those that may be in the lower socioeconomic class, that they can then have and reap rewards, Mr. President, from these new investments in the renewable energy sector. And lastly, sir, the waiver on excise tax and VAT on electric vehicles to increase the uptake of those types of vehicles. Mr. President, they are commendable, they are laudable, and they are needed measures for us to move forward. Sir, and in saying that, I also want to pause and acknowledge a few things. Because as good as those measures are, there are a few things, Mr. President, that we have to pay attention to. So when we incentivize the transition to EVs and hybrids, when I say EVs, I mean electric vehicles, that will obviously increase the demand for charging port infrastructure and the push to extra battery storage. My honourable member on the other side, he will know all about this. Sir, and what I want to say is that I don't know if I missed when the Minister of Energy may have spoken about it, but I want to re-emphasize it here, is that there is a need for a regulatory framework once we have that uptake in EVs and hybrids, Mr. President, a framework for vehicle-to-grid services and energy storage. We do not have it as yet. And I'm sure it is a priority, but I'm raising it now, Mr. President, because I know once you talk about waiving VAT and excise tax on EVs, Senator Boyce, with his funds, he's going to go and purchase now his electric vehicle. Senator Nurse is going to join him, and down the line we go. And the market now, Mr. President, is going to then run away from the regulatory framework. And then we don't have a way by which we deal with things like charging rates at high and low and peak demand hours. The rates for selling back to the grid when you charge, or if you have a full charge and you want to sell back to the electric grid, Mr. President, the supplier obligations that come along with that type of infrastructure, the consumer rights that come along with that infrastructure, sir, the service standards that come along with that type of infrastructure. This is a whole new set of infrastructure, Mr. President, that we are building out. The market, if there is a demand, will run ahead and fulfill the demand that is in the marketplace. But the regulatory environment, Mr. President, must be there so that both the supplier and the consumer are clear on the rules of engagement within the market. Sir, I know the Fair Trading Commission, they are the authority and they have the mandate for setting up the regulatory environment that keeps pace with the renewable energy transition. And based on some of the discussions that I've had with some of the members there, they have said that they require more financial and human resources, particularly skilled human resources, Mr. President, based on the amount of work that is required to get the regulatory framework up to date. And so when I looked through the estimates, I was quite distraught that I saw a reduction in the funds to the Fair Trading Commission of $250,000 down to $2.6 million. So I'm just questioning if the FTC has the required resources, Mr. President, to keep pace with the mandate that it has in terms of regularizing the renewable energy sector. Sir, there are other issues also that exist as it relates to things like decommissioning or end-of-life cycle policies for the technologies.
when we transition from all of these fossil fuel driven vehicles, Chris has a large SUV, sucks up a lot of diesel. What happens, Mr. President, when a lot of the fleet goes out of service? Where are we going to put them? We already have a problem Mr. President, with many mechanics across the island that have piles of vehicles that are unsightly, and there are people in the communities that complain about rodents and the unsightliness and how unhealthy it is for those who have to live around that kind of stockpile. And I just want us to be cognizant that although renewable energy is nature positive, it is not necessarily circular. And those who know what I am saying in terms of circular economy, making sure that there is a complete closure of the loop in terms of the production and consumption activities, renewable energy transitions still produce waste, and we have to have a comprehensive waste management strategy, Mr. President, for this transition. If not, we're going to find ourselves in problems, because we already, with municipal waste, have issues up at our landfills and the problems in terms of capacity. So, sir, I just wanted to acknowledge, Mr. President, there are some excellent measures as it relates to the proposals put forward by the Prime Minister. But then there are some issues that, in order to comprehensively deal with them in terms of the implementation, like the regulatory environment, making sure we have the right policies in place, that those issues are also dealt with and ventilated, Mr. President. Sir, and one thing I want to say as well is, and this is also somewhat of a bias that I have, is the renewable energy sector, and based on the measures that the Prime Minister has put forward, and she's made it very clear in no uncertain terms that, and this is my understanding of it, that the renewable energy sector, based on the amount of money that it is going to generate, Mr. President, cannot be a replica of the colonial structure of the sugar industry that we had. It cannot be a replica of the tourism industry. As much as we want to talk about tourism, there are only a few persons who own a large majority of the beds that exist in Barbados. The renewable energy sector, Mr. President, cannot replicate that type of economic structure. It has to be broad-based, and more people have to participate and benefit from that sector. And I think we are recognizing, Mr. President, that we are going to leave that type of structure where there's a few at the top, there are persons at the bottom waiting for the overflow. And that type of thinking is outdated, Mr. President, and it serves no place in the 21st century of Barbados. And we have to expand the income and the wealth of a greater proportion of our society. And we have the potential to do that in the renewable energy sector. Mr. President, I am going to then just quickly talk about another area that is important to me, that was mentioned in the Prime Minister's speech. And she mentioned it very shortly, but it is worth noting. In an attempt, Mr. President, to increase our economic output and our food production, the Prime Minister also made mention of marine farms. She made mention of marine farms, which is also known as mariculture. Once it's done in open water, once it's done on land, it's called aquaculture. And sir, what I would want to say is that we consume 8 times the amount of fish than we harvest locally. Our fish imports, yes, 86% of the fish that we consume. Sir, I'm hearing calls to eat more pork, but I would not advocate for that, being the pescatarian that I am. I would advocate for eating more fish. But sir, when she said that, I quickly recognized and I noted that the potential that initiative would have in terms of the increased production for food and fish, and also to lessen our reliance on imports, Mr. President. And that initiative is but a small fraction of the type of activities that we can have in our marine environment, because there is so much untapped potential that can take place for new jobs and investment, Mr. President, in our exclusive economic zone. And the Deputy President can tell us chapter, line, and verse about this, because the Deputy President has an extensive wealth and knowledge of experience of dealing with marine environment issues, Mr. President. That the size of our territorial waters, Mr. President, when you take Barbados' land mass, can fit into our territorial waters 432 times. And we are not even 1% aware of what lies in our oceans, especially to the east of Barbados, Mr. President. And all I am saying, Mr. President, is that there is scope, but there must be the requisite energy and efforts placed in to the activities that can come out of the blue economy. Mr. President, activities such as research tourism. Research tourism is a major untapped activity, given the 186,000 square miles that we have of territorial waters. So things like we can have a lot of deep sea benefit assessments being done, valuations, Mr. President, natural asset stocks, that then can feed into things like nutraceuticals, mineral mining, Mr. President. These are the types of high value sectors that we have the potential to then take advantage of. But it has to be based on ocean science. It cannot be based on anything else, Mr. President, to ensure that we do it sustainably. Because one of the things that we can't do in water is, Mr. President, have those secondary effects that happen on land, because the ocean is so interconnected and it has a 3D element to it. Because once a spill happens in the ocean, it spreads very quickly. It spreads very quickly, Mr. President, and the impact is felt differently than when we're talking about on terrestrial land. Mr. President, I'd also like to make a call for us to have a national mechanism, particularly because the blue economy is set to be a $3 trillion economy in the next few years. Barbados is a small island. If we have investments coming into Barbados, on average, that's $50 to $100 million, Mr. President, and based on the data that is coming out, a lot of those transactions that are happening in the blue economy are on average US $100 million. So you start to see the scope of what we're talking about in terms of the potential that the blue economy has. And Mr. President, in order to do that, there must be a central agency committed to attracting that type of blended finance coming into Barbados. And I don't know if that would be in the remit of the Export Barbados, because I know they have rebranded and there may be scope for that type of institutional framework and organization to sit within Export Barbados that deals specifically for those types of things. But Mr. President, I think that we have to have a dedicated mechanism that seeks to attract and deal with any financing coming into Barbados as it relates to activities in the ocean space. Mr. President, in wrapping up, I just want to say this. I came across a saying recently, and it really spoke to the times that we're living in, because the President is telling me to wrap up. So I'll go straight to this, Mr. President. It says, good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. And hard times produce strong men. And strong men create good times. Sir, we are in hard times. And I want to be a part of a Barbadian society that puts its hand to the plow so that if God spares my life in 20 to 30 years, I can say that was the moment that defined us in this country. And that is why we have people with the morality, with the values and the conviction of ensuring that Barbados can be the best it can be, Mr. President, because those hard times produced good men and women, Mr. President. I am obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Drakes. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move a suspension of this sitting for 15 minutes.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 5:50 this evening. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore suspended until 5:50 p.m.